What happens when one of America's most respected actresses comes face to face with a journalist who seems more interested in creating controversy than conducting an honest interview? You're about to witness one of the most explosive moments in morning television history. Make sure to subscribe and drop a comment below, because this is a story you won't believe until you hear every single word. The studio lights were blazing hot that Tuesday morning as Meryl Streep settled into the plush interview chair across from George Stephanopoulos. She had agreed to this appearance to promote her latest film, a powerful drama about immigrant families, but something felt different about George's demeanor from the moment she walked onto the set. "Good morning, Meryl," George began, his smile seeming forced as the cameras started rolling. "Thank you for joining us on Good Morning America." "Good morning, George. Always a pleasure," Meryl replied warmly, though she couldn't shake the feeling that this interview might not go as smoothly as her publicist had promised. George shuffled his notes dramatically, making sure the cameras caught his every movement. "Now, Meryl, your new film deals with some pretty controversial themes about immigration. Some critics are saying you're using your platform to push a political agenda rather than simply entertaining audiences." Meryl's eyebrows raised slightly. This wasn't the typical softball question she'd been expecting. "I think storytelling has always been about reflecting the human experience, George. When we ignore the struggles of real people, we're not doing our job as artists." "But don't you think," George interrupted, leaning forward aggressively, "that audiences are tired of being lectured by Hollywood celebrities? Especially when many of these celebrities live in gated communities, completely isolated from the very issues they claim to champion?" The accusation hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Meryl felt her jaw tighten, but she maintained her composure. "I'm not sure I understand what you're implying, George. I'm simply asking," George continued, his voice taking on a condescending tone, "whether someone who lives in a multi-million-dollar estate in Connecticut really understands the struggles of working-class Americans who are competing with immigrants for jobs." Meryl's eyes flashed with something George clearly wasn't prepared for. "Are you suggesting that because I've been fortunate in my career, I'm somehow incapable of empathy or understanding?" "I'm suggesting," George shot back, clearly pleased with himself, "that there might be a disconnect between your privileged perspective and the reality that ordinary Americans face every day." The studio crew began to shift uncomfortably. This was supposed to be a light promotional interview, but George was treating it like a political debate. His producers were frantically signaling from behind the cameras, but George seemed determined to press forward. "Let me ask you something, George," Meryl said, her voice still controlled but with an edge that longtime fans would recognize as dangerous territory. "Did you do any research about my background before this interview? Or did you just decide to wing it with some talking points you picked up from a political blog?" George's confident smirk faltered for just a moment. "Of course I did my research, Meryl. That's exactly why I'm asking these questions." "Really?" Meryl challenged. "Because if you had done your research, you would know that I grew up in a working-class family in New Jersey. My father worked in pharmaceuticals. My mother was a commercial artist. We weren't wealthy, George. We were the kind of people you're claiming I don't understand. But that was decades ago." George pressed, clearly not willing to back down. "Surely you can't claim to understand the current struggles of working families when you haven't lived that reality in over 40 years. Meryl leaned back in her chair, studying George with the kind of intense focus that had made her one of the greatest actresses of her generation. "So you're saying that success somehow erases understanding? That achievement cancels out compassion? I'm saying that it's easy to advocate for policies that sound generous when you won't personally bear the consequences of those policies." The temperature in the studio seemed to rise 10 degrees. Camera operators were getting closer, sensing that something explosive was building. George's co-hosts, who were supposed to join the segment later, were watching nervously from the wings. "What consequences are you referring to exactly?" Meryl asked, her voice becoming dangerously quiet. George consulted his notes again, clearly preparing for what he thought would be his knockout punch. "Well, for instance, you've been very vocal about supporting sanctuary cities, but you don't live in neighborhoods where undocumented immigrants are settling. You don't send your children to schools that are struggling with language barriers and overcrowding. You don't work in industries where wages are being suppressed by competition from people willing to work for less than minimum wage." Meryl was silent for a long moment, and George clearly interpreted this as victory. He leaned back in his chair with satisfaction, completely unaware that he had just lit a fuse on something much bigger than he could handle. "George," Meryl finally said, her voice still eerily calm. "I want to make sure I understand your position correctly. Are you saying that unless someone personally experiences every aspect of a social issue, they have no right to advocate for humane policies?" "I'm saying that advocacy without understanding is just virtue signaling," George replied smugly. "Virtue signaling," Meryl repeated slowly, as if tasting something bitter. "That's an interesting phrase coming from someone who makes his living asking questions he already thinks he knows the answers to." George's smile was becoming more strained by the second, but he pressed on. "I think our viewers appreciate honest questions about the disconnect between Hollywood rhetoric and American reality." "Your viewers," Meryl said, emphasis heavy on the word your, "might also appreciate honest journalism instead of ambush interviews designed to create viral moments." The accusation hit its mark. George's face flushed red, and several crew members exchanged glances. This was definitely not going according to his plan. "Viral moments?" George sputtered, his composure completely shattered. "I'm conducting serious journalism here, asking the tough questions that need to be asked." "Are you?" Meryl challenged, and now there was no mistaking the steel in her voice. "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you came into this interview with a predetermined narrative, and you're trying to force me to fit into it regardless of the facts." George tried to regain control, shuffling his papers aggressively. "The facts are that Hollywood celebrities consistently advocate for policies they'll never have to live with the consequences of." "The facts," Meryl said, leaning forward now, "are that you just spent the last 5 minutes making assumptions about my life, my background, and my motivations without bothering to ask a single genuine question about the film I'm here to discuss. This is about more than just your film, Meryl." "No, George, this is about exactly what you want it to be about. And what you want it to be about is creating a confrontation that you can use to boost your ratings." The accusation hung in the air like a thunderclap. George's face went through several shades of red before settling on a particularly unflattering crimson. "That's completely unfair." "Is it?" Meryl asked. "Because I'm looking at your notes there, and I can see you've written push back on privilege angle and get emotional response. Should I keep reading? Or would you prefer to admit that this was never intended to be a legitimate interview?" George instinctively covered his notes, but it was too late. The damage was done, and everyone in the studio knew it. His producers were now gesturing frantically, clearly trying to signal him to change course, but George seemed incapable of backing down. "Those are just interview preparation notes," he said defensively. "Interview preparation," Meryl repeated, her voice dripping with disdain. "Is that what you call it when you decide beforehand what narrative you want to create, and then badger your guest until they either conform to it or lose their temper? I think you're being overly sensitive here, Meryl." The words were barely out of his mouth before Meryl's eyes flashed with something that made several crew members take a step back. "Overly sensitive? Let me tell you what's sensitive, George. What's sensitive is a journalist who can't handle being called out for shoddy preparation and dishonest tactics." "Now wait just a minute," George started, but Meryl cut him off with a gesture that could have frozen lava. "No, you wait just a minute. You invited me here under false pretenses. You told my publicist this would be about my new film, about the craft of acting, about the stories we're trying to tell. Instead, you've turned this into some kind of political gotcha game where you're trying to make me look like an out-of-touch elite." "If the shoe fits," George muttered, clearly thinking he was being clever. The studio went dead silent. Even the camera operators stopped moving. Meryl stared at George with the kind of intensity that had earned her 3 Academy Awards and the respect of everyone in Hollywood except, apparently, the man sitting across from her. "If the shoe fits," she repeated slowly. "George, do you have any idea how insulting that is? Not just to me, but to every artist who has ever tried to use their platform to shine light on important issues. I'm just saying that there's a pattern here with Hollywood celebrities and political activism." "A pattern," Meryl said, and her voice was getting quieter, which somehow made it more terrifying. "Let me tell you about patterns, George. There's a pattern of journalists who have forgotten that their job is to inform the public, not to create controversy for its own sake. There's a pattern of interviewers who think that being confrontational is the same thing as being incisive." George was sweating now, visible beads forming on his forehead under the hot studio lights. "I think you're taking this too personally." "Too personally?" Meryl's voice rose for the first time, and the sound echoed through the studio like a crack of thunder. "You spend 15 minutes attacking my character, my background, my motivations, my integrity, and you think I'm taking it too personally?" I was asking legitimate questions about the disconnect between celebrity activism and real-world consequences. "No, you weren't," Meryl shot back, her voice now carrying the full power of her theatrical training. "You were performing. You were putting on a show for your audience where you get to play the tough journalist, taking down the privileged celebrity. Well, congratulations, George. You got your show." George tried to smile, but it looked more like a grimace. "I think we're having a productive discussion about important issues." AT.com. Productive? Meryl laughed, but there was no humor in it whatsoever. "You want to know what would be productive, George? Actually listening to the answers instead of just waiting for your turn to attack, actually asking questions that come from curiosity instead of predetermined conclusions. I am listening to your answers." "Really? Then tell me, what did I say about my childhood when you asked about understanding working-class struggles?" George opened his mouth, then closed it, clearly scrambling to remember. The silence stretched on for an eternity before Meryl shook her head in disgust. "You can't remember, can you? Because you weren't listening. You were just waiting for me to finish talking so you could launch your next prepared attack. That's not fair, Meryl. What's not fair is bringing someone on your show under false pretenses and then ambushing them with hostile questions designed to make them look bad. What's not fair is pretending to be a journalist when what you're really doing is performance art." George's jaw was clenched so tight it looked painful. "I resent the implication that I'm not a real journalist." "Then start acting like one," Meryl fired back without hesitation. The words hit George like a physical blow. His face went from red to purple, and he slammed his hand down on the desk between them. "Don't you dare lecture me about journalism. I've been doing this for decades." "Have you?" Meryl asked, and her voice was deadly calm again, which was somehow more frightening than when she'd been shouting. "Because what I've witnessed here today isn't journalism. It's character assassination disguised as an interview." George was breathing heavily now, clearly losing whatever remained of his professional composure. "You Hollywood types are all the same. The moment someone challenges your worldview, you cry foul and play the victim." That was it. That was the moment when Meryl Streep, 3-time Academy Award winner, accomplished actress, and consummate professional, finally erupted. "Victim?" she exploded, rising from her chair so fast that it rolled backward and nearly toppled over. "Victim? Let me tell you something about victims, George. Victims don't get to sit in studios and defend themselves against hack journalists who think ambush tactics pass for legitimate interviewing." The entire studio froze. Crew members stopped what they were doing. Cameras kept rolling, but the operators looked like they wanted to run. George's co-hosts, who had been waiting in the wings, disappeared entirely. "You want to talk about victims?" Meryl continued, her voice now carrying the full power of decades of stage training. "Let's talk about the immigrant families whose stories I'm trying to tell in this film. Let's talk about the children who are separated from their parents. Let's talk about the people who risk everything for a chance at a better life. Those are victims, George. Not some pampered television personality who can't handle being called out for his unprofessional behavior." George tried to stand up, but Meryl's presence was so commanding that he seemed pinned to his chair. "Now you're being dramatic." "Dramatic?" Meryl's laugh was like broken glass. "You think this is dramatic? You haven't seen dramatic yet. You want dramatic? Here's dramatic. You invited me here to discuss a film about human dignity, about compassion, about the struggles of people who have nothing. And instead, you turned it into a cheap political stunt, designed to humiliate me for your entertainment. That's not what happened here. Isn't it?" Meryl roared, and her voice echoed through the studio like thunder. "Then explain to me why you have notes about getting an emotional response. Explain to me why you didn't ask a single question about the film, about the performances, about the story we're trying to tell. Explain to me why every single question was designed to make me look like an out-of-touch elitist." George was stammering now, completely overwhelmed by the fury he had unleashed. "I was just trying to provide balance." "Balance?" Meryl's voice cracked like a whip. You call this balance? You call ambushing your guest with hostile questions balance? You call making assumptions about someone's character without bothering to learn basic facts about their background balance? You're overreacting, Meryl. Am I? Am I overreacting when a so-called journalist brings me on his show and then spends the entire time trying to tear me down instead of having an actual conversation? Am I overreacting when someone who claims to be a professional behaves like a tabloid hack looking for his next viral moment? George's producers were now frantically signaling to cut to commercial, but it was clear that neither George nor Meryl was paying any attention to them. This train had left the station, and there was no stopping it now. You want to know what's really pathetic here, George? Meryl continued, her voice now carrying a cold fury that was somehow more devastating than her shouting had been. What's pathetic is that you had an opportunity to have a real conversation about important issues. You could have asked thoughtful questions about immigration, about storytelling, about the responsibility of artists. Instead, you chose to turn this into some kind of cheap reality television drama. I was asking the questions that needed to be asked. No, you weren't, Meryl exploded again, slamming her own hand on the desk. You were asking the questions that would get you the most attention. There's a difference, and the fact that you can't see that difference is exactly what's wrong with journalism today. George tried one more desperate attempt to regain control. I think our viewers can see who's really being unreasonable here. The words were barely out of his mouth before Meryl fixed him with a stare that could have melted steel. Your viewers, she said, her voice now so quiet that everyone in the studio had to strain to hear her. Your viewers deserve better than this. They deserve journalists who actually care about informing the public, instead of creating spectacle. They deserve interviewers who ask questions because they want to learn something, not because they want to destroy someone. I wasn't trying to destroy anyone. Weren't you? Meryl's final eruption shook the studio walls. Then what do you call this, George? What do you call bringing someone on your show under false pretenses, and then spending the entire time attacking their character? What do you call having predetermined talking points designed to make your guests look bad? What do you call ignoring everything they say so you can launch your next prepared assault? George was completely speechless now, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. The confident smirk he had worn at the beginning of the interview was long gone, replaced by the look of someone who had bitten off far more than he could chew. I'll tell you what I call it, Meryl continued, her voice now carrying the quiet authority that had made her one of the most respected actors of her generation. I call it cowardice. I call it the behavior of someone who has forgotten what real journalism looks like. I call it the desperate flailing of a man who thinks that being confrontational is the same thing as being brave. Meryl, I think we should probably wrap this up, George said weakly, clearly hoping to end his misery. Oh, now you want to wrap it up, Meryl said, and her smile was absolutely terrifying. Now, when you've been exposed for what you really are, you want to end the interview. How convenient. George looked pleadingly at his producers, but they were as frozen as everyone else. This was live television, and there was nowhere to hide. You know what, George? Meryl said, gathering her things with the dignity of a queen. I hope your viewers got exactly what they were looking for. I hope they enjoyed watching you embarrass yourself and your network. And I hope that someday, you remember what it means to be a journalist instead of a performer. She stood up, looked directly into the camera, and delivered her final devastating blow. To everyone watching at home, I want you to remember something. When journalists stop asking questions to learn and start asking questions to attack, we all lose something important. When interviews become ambushes, when conversation becomes confrontation, when truth becomes secondary to entertainment, we're not just failing as media professionals, we're failing as human beings. George sat in stunned silence as Meryl walked off the set, leaving him alone with his shattered dignity and the smoking ruins of what was supposed to have been a simple promotional interview. The cameras kept rolling, capturing every second of his humiliation for posterity. What did you think of this explosive confrontation? Have you ever seen a celebrity completely destroy a journalist's credibility like this? Drop a comment below and let me know your thoughts, and don't forget to subscribe for more incredible moments like this one. What other celebrity interview disasters would you like to see covered next?